Article 11 of the Senate had not been used in the living memory of all but 2 species that were subject to it. So when the aid of the lead senator of the Chikanomori had invoked the article, most of the chamber had to refresh themselves on what the article actually covered and what it entailed. Out of the myriad species that made up the Senate, currently only 4 could actually do what the Chikanomori had done. The Williamac, the de facto leaders of the Senate, had immediately approved the invocation, with the Dolvarm as well as the Numerio citing their approval, even if it wasn't needed for the article to carry. Around the building, media outlets from every species that actually used them were speaking 1,000 languages, broadcasting to their people information on the article itself, what it entailed, and the Chikanomori. The floor of the Senate was standing room only in some cases, as the blue-skinned Williamac roll called the Senate into their chairs. Attendance, in the event of this article being invoked, was not an option, and in most cases the entire diplomatic staff of an interstellar power was there, ready to send reports, request information, or relay information. Even Kiziko, the sole remaining ambassador for the Terran front, was in attendance, even though he had a medical aide standing next to his chair, the Chua still recovering from the attack by the Voral ambassador and its staff. In fact, the only conspicuously empty plinth was the Voral Empire plinth itself, as well as the plinth for a species known as the Urale, whose ambassador had suffered some sort of medical emergency only a few weeks prior and had become for the most part catatonic. Attempts had been made to contact the Urale ambassador's people, but if they had gotten the messages, they hadn't responded. As far as the Voral, there was a much simpler reason that they were not in attendance that everyone knew. The entire delegation had been wiped out by Volka, as well as the security staff, and they had been temporarily barred. On holo displays and flat-panel large displays from one corner of the galaxy to the other, on data slates, consoles, or in some cases beamed directly into the mind of the species, images of the internal chamber of the Senate were displayed. Every so often the feeds would switch to images of the lead ambassador of the Chikanomori, who in terms of sheer body size was one of the largest figures in the chamber itself. When the Chikanomori had invoked the article, it had not been met with a lot of attention, but that only lasted for a few hours until the full meaning of it had a chance to be understood by the galaxy at large. Article 11 was invoked to deal with threats that could upend or greatly harm not just individual species or even star groupings. Article 11 was invoked to deal with threats on a quadrant scale or higher, matters that would affect the entirety of the galaxy itself. The speaker concluded the roll call, marking only the Voral absent. Across the galaxy, Simmons leaned back in her chair in her office on board the Antares. She stopped mid-pour, then glanced to Hazard, who was sitting on a stool next to her. She motioned to a glass, and Hazard reached for it. She poured her newest bridge officer a drink, then finished her own pour. The camera cut back to a blonde woman who was yammering on about the last 6 times in the last 5,000 years Article 11 had been invoked. Simmons just wanted to see the massive snake alien with the 4 arms again. This was apparently the same one, if her reports were right, that had killed the Voral who had killed Ambassador Willis. She already liked him in that case. Tika sat on the mattress of the quarters that he had been provided. The rest of his staff crowded around him as they looked at the small data slate propped up against a pillow. Tika actually felt warm for the first time in quite a while. Kazia was nestled close by him, and he glanced at her as she moved ever closer. He was a fool, of course. He was shamed and disgraced, and she was very young, but from time to time he thought she fancied him. An old bird's fantasy, he thought, even as the gray-feathered Turinica on the screen spoke. The image cut over to the Senate floor, where the speaker was now reading the article aloud for all in attendance to bear witness to. Conrad leaned back in his chair on the bridge of the Dampier as the blob-like blue-skinned Williamac continued to read. Cass was pressed up against his chair, even though she could have accessed the feed from her own. His hand had a firm grip on her hip, which was a relatively recent development that she had been smirking about for the last 2 minutes. Originally, he had taken hold of her to help her keep her balance. Now it was because of the look she kept giving him that he was doing his dead-level best to ignore. Rev and Dev were talking in their chairs, and Fidget was, well, fidgeting. Cass leaned forward as the massive Chicana Mori was called by the speaker. As Volka ascended the rampway to the speaker's position, the Senate floor had grown silent. Volka held in two hands a data slate, the other two hands firmly clasped behind his back as his body coiled and relaxed, propelling him onwards. He bowed his head to the Williamok speaker, who took 2 steps back and seemed to vibrate a moment. Volka slowly began to coil his massive form, even as the receiver that had transmitted the speaker's voice raised almost 2 meters to accommodate his figure. He was silent, and to many of those watching, especially those of his own kin, dignified in that silence, slowly coiling his long body. As he finished coiling himself, he gently placed the data slate on the plinth, then curled both sets of arms behind his back. Esteemed representatives of this Senate Hall, Speaker, it is on a matter most dire I come before the chamber today, to speak to this entire body, for the first time in my long history of service to my people. He bowed his head once. I thank all of you for your attention. Once more, Volka let the silence hang. He's scared, Hazard said, and Simmons glanced at him. Simmons looked closely at the massive snake-like alien, but whatever Hazard was seeing, she didn't. On the monitor, the Chicana Mori slowly began speaking again. This body, this collection of representatives from every spacefaring civilization that has left its own home system, was formed during a time of absolute desperation. Volka leaned back and brought all 4 of his hands to rest on the plinth in front of him. It was first conceived during a time where war had torn the galaxy almost in half. Civilizations were dying out, and those who simply wished to survive banded together to form a unified force to push dark the darkness that was steadily devouring everything it touched. Volka, ever the statesman, slowly opened his arms to encompass the entire hall. Of the 6 original members of the alliance that eventually became this Senate, 2 of that number are gone. We, the Chicana Mori, remain, alongside the Williamok Congress, the Dolvarm people, and the Numerio Unity. All 3 have been presented with the same information that I will now present to you. 3 of the 4 arms gestured to the 3 other founding species. Since our 4 people, so separated by distance between the lanes between stars, joined hands, this hall has grown. Since the time of the founding, we have watched this hall be filled with young faces and some old ones. Volka curled his arms behind his back again and lowered his head. This body is slowly filled with the sound of trade disputes, border questions, and matters of legal nature, but it was founded by a declaration of war. It is with that founding in mind that I now speak this day. Volka's hand stabbed accusingly towards the empty plinth of the Voral. The Voral Empire, without check for the last several hundred years, has conquered its neighbors. He slowly turned his massive head towards the empty plinth. This, to be fair, is nothing new. Many species utilize aggressive expansionism. They are not the first, and they will not be the last. Slowly, Volka's head turned, slowly taking in the room. What was unknown to us until very recently was what they were doing within their borders. Volka's hand slowly curled behind his back once more, and the Chicana Mori straightened. It is not the practice of this body to encroach on the internal matters or happenings of any species, and so when the Voral Empire declared war against its neighbors, sometimes very publicly in this very chamber, we as a community remained silent. Across the galaxy, as the ambassador stopped speaking on the display, Conrad shook his head, even as Rev loudly declared, "No shit." Volka then motioned to the Terran front's plinth slowly. It was only due to the actions of the humans and the Chwa that these discoveries I am relaying to you have been uncovered at all. Slowly, Volka let his arm glide down to his side. It has come to our attention that the Voral, willfully or willfully ignorant, have been attempting to contact. He paused for a moment, drew in a breath, then finished, and when he spoke, the words came in the sibilant hiss of his native tongue, untranslated because for thousands of years there had been no translation. His entire body curled at the pronunciation like he had eaten something rotten. Sevens, watching the same broadcast from his temporary quarters on board the battleship Saratoga, closed the broadcast and reopened it rapidly. On the Dom Pier, Dev yelled out, "Hey chill, what the fuck are slana shtaha okalas?" Chill looked at Dev, even as the Chikanamori remained silent, impressed at how close to the actual sound Dev had come. Through the broadcast, noise began to slowly grow, and Conrad turned up the volume of his monitor. Tika watched as the voice of the Tyranican reporter cut in over the growing noise of the chamber, trying in hurried tones to explain that the most comparable translations for what the speaker had just said would be displayed. Xia sucked in a breath beside Tika as several words in the flowing script of the Tyranica were displayed on the screen below the image of the Chikanamori. Outsider, unwelcome, defiler, dread, anathema. Tika's head slowly canted to the side. Suddenly the words went away, replaced by a single name. Tika's beak fell open in shock. In the room, not a single one of them drew a breath, and Tika felt deathly cold for a reason that had nothing to do with his plumage. Kazakhstana. Tika hadn't heard that name since he was a child. Simmons stared at the words displayed on the screen. Outsider, unwelcome, defiler, dread, anathema. And slowly she looked to Hazard. He shook his head as he looked back to her. The words remained on the screen. The massive snake-like creature remained silent, even as the volume of the Senate floor started to become a cacophony. The image panned away from the Chikanamori, and on the Senate floor some of the attending senators and staff were making gestures and showing body language that Simmons needed no help in translating. Shock, outrage, denial, and in some of the senators, near panic. Many of the delegations, including the Terran Front's own Chua delegate, stood in surprised confusion, looking around at the others with a growing sense of trepidation. Simmons looked down at the words again. Outsider, unwelcome, defiler, dread, anathema. Slowly she took a drink. Hazard, I'll make you a commander right the fuck now if you tell me what the hell that snake just said. She stared at the monitor, expecting Hazard to speak. She looked back to Hazard, who remained silent. As she looked back to the screen, the 5 words vanished and something else took its place. What the fuck? She whispered. On the screen was a name, Lucifer Morningstar. Volka kept his silence, letting the translators do their work. The Dovarum hadn't approved of this method at first, but they had come around to Volka's line of reasoning. The translators were translating the name of the great enemy as best they could, in many cases using names from ancient legends. There was no word for them in many species, but for those that did, they understood. The entire Pilinesti detachment had fainted to the floor. Warbles, clicks, hisses, and calls mixed in a horrific cacophony from those species who had the direct translation from their own historical records. Confusion, and in some cases incredulity, was etched on the face of those whose translators had chosen a legendary proxy to convey meaning. He remained silent, but slowly began to raise his hands. The noise began to die down slowly, then much more rapidly as silence reigned in the hall. Some of you lack the true name of that which the Voral are reaching out for. Rest assured, the names of your legends and myths will suffice to convey what I speak of. Volka's upper right hand snapped out towards the Voral Empire's empty plinth. To those who know the true name of the great enemy, the Voral have been, for a time period we do not know, been attempting to attract them here. Volka slowly raised himself behind the plinth, towering over it. After conferring with my colleagues from the Williamac, comparing their historical notes to our own, my government has reached out to the Numerio and asked them to analyze in particular radiation harmonic signature dot, which has appeared on every inhabited world the Terran Front has scanned. Volka paused, then leaned over the DS. A radiation signature from facilities which the Voral have taken great pains to ensure are destroyed before they can be captured, as the Chua ambassador from the Terran Front can attest. Simmons watched on the screen as the massive snake-like creature motioned again toward the Terran Front's plinth, and the Chua ambassador Xitko behind it, who only bobbed his head once. The Numerio's findings matched our own, and they shared their findings with the Dolvarm. The Chikanamori continued, and Simmons leaned back. She stippled her fingers in front of her chin, staring, feeling a sudden pang of worry. On the Senate floor, Volka spread his arms wide. Our 4 governments are in agreement. The following are the facts, and they cannot be disputed. Volka motioned to the Voral plinth once more. The Voral, for reasons we do not know, have been flooding their local system with what at first appeared to be harmless alpha-wave ultraviolet radiation directed towards a singular location deep within their own space. The radiation word of a type harmful to most life would have scoured the continent, the facilities transmitting it of all life, even hardened bacteria within seconds of being turned on just from spillover. Any ship that could have read the bloom would likewise be scoured, such was the intensity. Volka's eyes glanced to the Dolvarm plinth, and the ambassador there slowly raised two of its tendrils, the squid-like creature staring back. Once we compared the patterns, frequency, and signatures of the signals the Voral Empire has been pouring into their system with our own ancient sources, all four of our governments have decided to sound off, in one voice. The Chikanomori slowly began to expand his form outwards, curling and coiling his form until he actually began to look his mass, compared with all the times he took pains to disguise it. As of this moment, we are reaffirming the martial alliance that we joined together in so long ago, and as one with one voice, declare on the Voral a state of war. The sounds of shock and surprise rolled out from the monitor as Conrad sucked in a breath. "Well, shit," Cass whispered, looking from the monitor to him as the massive snake-like alien closed his eyes. "Well, shit," she almost yelled. Conrad tightened his grip on her hip involuntarily as he leaned forward, making a silencing motion with this hand as the Chikanomori looked to continue. Volka motioned with his hands as if he was encompassing the entire room. Most of the Senate floor was looking at him in surprise. The delegates from his own quadrant were staring in shock, and undoubtedly to him a fair amount of fear. Of the major powers in the galaxy, the Chikanomori had few rivals, and the knowledge that that war machine was being activated for the first time was a terrifying prospect. To our neighbors, to our partners, to our friends, I will be reaching out to you soon to humbly ask permission to allow our fleets to travel and resupply in your space. He raised his hands in a placating gesture. It is not our intent to bring any who do not wish conflict into this war that we now must engage in, but make no mistake. Volka paused and closed his eyes and breathed in, hating the next words he was going to speak. He opened his eyes. This is not a conflict in which sides can be chosen, or where neutrality can be respected in all cases. This is not a border war or a trade skirmish. Volka stared into the distance. This is a fight against time that we did not know we were engaged in, and the stakes are our very survival. Tika's group was completely silent, staring at the monitor as if they were getting the very oxygen needed to breathe from it. Tika's neck curled into his body almost painfully as he stared at the Chikanomori. The last time the Chikanomori had gone to war, the Turinica Conclave was still exploring its home system, still under the belief that they were the only sentient species in the galaxy, and the concept of them going to war was as if one could swim through stone. Tika had worked with Volka often, and could never even conceive the massive ambassador would ever need to speak these words. Volka was silent on the screen now, his head bowed. The Chikanomori knew perfectly well what he said without actually saying it, and Tika knew perfectly well that he meant it. The Chikanomori, alongside three of the oldest and most powerful nation-states in the galaxy, were coming to the Voral, and they were not going to take no for an answer. He was reminded of something that one of the first humans he had known well, tombs, a funny statement, meant as a curse to some humans. "May you live in interesting times," he whispered, but none of his kind turned to look or ask what he meant. Volka looked to his left, then his right. "To those of you who wish to assist us militarily, we welcome this with open arms and encourage it." He flexed his coils subconsciously. "This is a war of extinction declared on us all without our knowledge. We intend to win." Volka slid back from the podium and rested on his coils silently as the Senate floor, almost sensing his speech was over, began to erupt into noise. He felt like his brain was on fire. He slowly breathed out, glancing around as the plinth surrounding him became utter hives of activity, eyes, stalks, feelers. All were turned towards him and back to their own people. "So it begins," Volka whispered. Simmons left the live play running, then looked to Hazard, who was just staring silently at the monitor. Simmons turned her gaze back to the display that was showing the Chikanomori ambassador resting on muscled coils. Her steepled fingers came to rest under her chin again, and she leaned back into her chair. A red light began flashing on the corner of her screen, and she stared at it. Hazard perked up as the light began flashing, knowing the alert on the monitor that signified an urgent alert. Simmons didn't move. Her fingers pressed hard against her chin as an audible tone began to sound, steadily growing in volume, meant to wake up the receiver if they were sleeping in their quarters. Hazard glanced to Simmons, then back to her monitor. The tone grew louder, but Simmons remained a statue. Hazard reached out and tentatively put his hand close to Simmons, looking as if he was about to speak. Her hand came up to silence him, then reached out, her finger hovering over the icon. The tone continued. The light continued. She stared at the light, then finally pressed the icon. "I already know. I'm coming." Simmons dropped her hand to the desk and stared at the monitor. Hazard rose to his feet and began walking to the door, stopping when he noticed that Simmons was still at her desk. He turned back to her and paused in his steps. Simmons looked up at him, then slowly rose to her feet. Instead of walking to the door, she turned, moving to the small viewport. She stared out into the stars, at the distant sun of this alien system, standing further away from Earth than most of her species in their history had ever conceived of standing. It could all end here. She whispered to herself, knowing that the Voral were coming, knowing without knowing, but knowing nonetheless. The Voral were coming, and would vent their rage trying one last time to strike them from the stars. It could all end here with this strange daylight watching us. She blinked once, then turned, moving past Hazard, who fell into step behind her. Before she had even reached the bridge, the first reports of broadcasted screams began to arrive. Simmons stalked onto the bridge, hearing the screams of the victims of the Voral echoing along the massive hall. Her scowl was etched so hard into her features that it could have cut stone. All around her were ashen faces, and as she moved with Hazard at her side, she couldn't help but see the morale being sucked out of the ship, as if the hideous creatures had set up a direct siphon. "The bastards kept the recordings," she growled where only Hazard could hear. "You'd think the fuckers would have hobbies." Hazard seemed to flinch, and she looked over at him as they walked. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't look angry or drained as so many others did. He looked sick. "Fleet Marshal." He began slowly, and she stopped, prompting him to do so as well. The petty officer she had promoted to her direct assistant looked away a moment, then he looked back to her. He shook his head, then started again. "I used to listen to the old comms records from the First War, when Thermopylae was holding back the first assault." She raised an eyebrow, but he continued. "It's morbid, I know, but I have all the old recordings and transmissions on file. I guess it's my way to remind myself what I'm doing out here. I've heard the transmissions of the Voral so many times I can tell you which one will come next. Man or woman, boy or girl." Simmons said nothing. He wasn't exactly alone in that particular morbid habit of listening to the communications network recordings of the First War. As a matter of course, the recordings of the First Voral War's communications were worth listening to for anyone who wanted to hear in real time how to stop an unstoppable force with an immovable object. Hazard just happened to be a little more macabre than most when it came to which recordings he listened to. The first time she found out people actually listened to the Voral transmissions, she had been revolted, but that had been decades ago. Now, she barely gave it a second thought. She just nodded to him. "These are not the old recordings," he said, answering her unasked question. These are new." "What do you—" Simmons began, but then she stopped cold as she realized what he was actually saying. It felt like a bucket of ice water was poured down her spine. Hazard's teeth were firmly clenched between words, his voice biting as a particularly agonized shriek sounded throughout the bridge. "The voices have different accents. I can't understand half of what—" He paused as the sound of someone screaming for mercy cut them both to the nerve endings. He breathed out, then whispered, "These are new. Recorded recently, maybe even live." "Fucking hell," Simmons whispered, then roared so loud it made Hazard jump. "Someone shut that shit off." She spun on her heel, facing the door she had to her quarters, facing away from her bridge and the crew. Her eyes blazed with absolute fury, fury that bordered on despair. She had always held on to the hope that her fleet would deliver the descendants of the lost and taken of humanity. If Hazard was right, that hope was gone. A sudden shriek from someone far too young to know that level of pain cut through her ears like a dagger straight through her soul, and her entire body quaked with helpless fury. "Shut it the fuck off! Now!" The hope wasn't just gone, it had been destroyed. It was finished. The Voral would kill every human they had their hands on now, knowing what was coming for them. A few seconds later, the bridge went completely silent. Hundreds of people that usually would have snapped towards her at an outburst like that stared straight ahead, looking down at consoles, off into the distance, anywhere else they could divert their attention. She swore under her breath, the look to Hazard as one of the Chua bridge officers came to a stop beside her. "Apologies. Voral transmission all bands, bridge fleet comms compromised." The Chua made his report, and again Simmons swore again. "Get the fleet on encrypted communications. Send word to the outlying systems and anyone still coming to the front to get here as fast as they can. Any word from the outer pickets?" she asked, referring to the corvettes waiting in all directions at least 3 jumps distant from the fleet. The Chua shook his head no, mimicking the human gesture. "Well, keep an ear open. They're coming. They wouldn't be playing us their version of the Moonlight Sonata if they weren't." The Chua officer bobbed his head once and his feet pattered off as he moved to relay her commands. Simmons stared after the Chua, and once again she talked low, her voice barely carrying to Hazard. "Go with him, help in any way you can. We need every ship we have and half the ones we don't." Hazard nodded once, then stepped off after the Chua, matching the smaller figure's pace as they fell in step alongside each other. "Fuck," she whispered when she was alone. The bridge, normally filled with the dull roar of hundreds talking at once, footfalls and the padded taps of Chua tails, was now virtually silent. Every face she saw looked drawn, weathered. An image of her father suddenly flipped into her mind, seeing him come back to Tallahassee after almost 8 months at Thermopylae Station. Her eyes settled on a young woman who was manning a power transfer console. Her eyes were distant, her expression flat. How long had they heard the screams? Her father was close to her now, but in her childhood when he was home from the front he had been a ghost, his eyes haunted. One day she had asked him what it was like, and on her 16th birthday he had told her, "When the screams come, you know someone is dead. When you look around, you know someone else will be." His words echoed in her head now. Her fleet was strong, no doubt. In an even fight they wouldn't just beat the Voral. They would simply eradicate them. Against the sheer weight of numbers the Voral had, though. What were her options? Fall back to Thermopylae and leave everyone they had liberated to their death? Cut and run back to the safety of the battle station that had protected humanity for so long, and leave the survivors of the Chua homeworld, the HFY, and so many others? "Dad, is this what it felt like?" she thought, turning her head to look out of the massive viewport at the stars, at the dim light cast on the framing. In the corner of her eye she saw Hazard holding up his hand in her direction and glanced over. She nodded once and Hazard quickly made his way over. As he reached her, he moved to her right-hand side and looked out of the viewport with her. "What's the news?" she whispered. "Outer picket at the narrated system gate is showing a jump signature on the other side. We have a ship coming in." After a moment, Hazard motioned with his head off into the void of space. "That direction." He paused a moment and Simmons breathed in, squaring her shoulders. She felt a wave of anticipation that she fought down. "The fleet's comms are secure. We're doubling the rate of frequency shift just to make sure we don't lose it going forward. The Voral are transmitting on every channel they can." Both of them knew what the ship coming in was without stating the obvious. A picket was coming. Most ships lacked the ability to transmit between systems, relying on intra-system communications. The smallest ship that could house the gear needed to send long-distance communication were cruisers, and only if they dedicated a good deal of power to it. A battleship would have already told her what she wanted to know from not just the narrated system, but the second and third in the line. One didn't risk a battleship for that, though. She motioned to the command DS and the large table, and he followed her. As she reached the side, she drew her monitor up and activated it. then set the table for the local hyperlane map. She stared down at the monitor and waited. Hazard brought up a secondary monitor and began tapping at the screen. "Setting the table?" she asked, and he nodded once. She tapped her fingers on the table, waiting. She felt her eyes drifting over the lane map, the 7 systems connected to the 3 in which her fleet was spread out, nestled 2 jumps from the Turanikian border, 10 jumps behind them, Thermopylae, and somewhere in front of them. The lane map shifted and multiple images came onto the table's screen. "Picket is in system. They're transmitting." "Good," she whispered to herself, and for some reason she did feel some measure of real relief. She looked to the table and began drawing files to her monitor. The second she did and actually looked, she had to clench her teeth. Hazard was doing much the same as her. She didn't need to look to the stations around her to know that others had been waiting on the very report she was getting now. And for a moment she almost locked them behind an eyes-only command. The first corvette in the picket line, 3 systems distant, had taken detailed scans of what had entered their system before they jumped, as well as trajectories. Simmons stared at the report now, feeling her soul shrivel at the sheer weight of the raw fleet that was coming. She glanced over to see Hazard's hands holding onto the edge of the monitor, his knuckles white. She wanted the luxury of screaming right now in fury or grief. Either would be good. "Send word to the pickets to go back through. Ensure that fleet's course and stay until they can't." Hazard looked her way, saw the look of resigned anger in his features, the unasked questions there. His expression sent a rod of molten iron through her spine. She had a duty not just to this ship but everyone on it, in its fleet and alive in the Terran front. She did not have the luxury of doubts. She didn't have the benefit of feeling hopeless or wallowing in despair. In the fortress of her mind, cast iron gates built over years of command and duty slammed shut, and suddenly her purpose was clear. Her eyes shifted, her spine straightened, and Hazard straightened a bit as well. "Our goal here," she began, turning back to the panel and punching a few icons, "is to hurt them." Hazard slowly nodded to her. Simmons didn't mention survival. Survival at this point was now a secondary concern. No, survival wasn't even a priority. She slowly tucked her arms behind her. "Go transmit the orders to the pickets. Set a fleet clock for 36 hours. Hazard's eyes hardened and he turned. "Hazard," Simmons said, her voice sharp, and he stopped to look back at her. She took in a breath and locked eyes with him. Her lip quirked upwards in a smirk, and he raised an eyebrow for a moment before her expression became infectious. "Why the long face? We're about to kill a lot of Voral here." His face began to split into a predatory grin. "Yes, ma'am, we are," Hazard said. Her eyes narrowed and she gestured with her head to the screen. "Set up a brief for the brass. We've got a fleet to gut." She turned back to her screen and began to tap icons to organize her information. Hazard stalked off to carry out her orders. She stared at the reports as she sorted them, putting them into an order that she could work with. The scans from the picket were something out of an absolute nightmare. She paused a moment as a detailed readout hung on the monitor before her. To anyone who would look, not understanding the information, it was just a readout of signatures by differing mass. To her, it was a gun pointed at her head, with a finger that was slowly tightening on the trigger. It was a monster lurking in the dark, coming to devour her. She was staring at her death, her fleet's death. She stared at the displays, the recorded metallic mass returns. A part of her, locked away deep inside, wanted to scream her injustices done to herself and her people at the top of her lungs. How had the Voral managed to assemble a fleet like this? How could they have been this wrong about the Voral's fleet capabilities? None of that mattered. She was going to die. Her fleet was going to die. It didn't matter. All that mattered now was to hurt the monster, maim it, to wound it so heavily that it couldn't keep moving. At the very least, if all else failed, to weaken it so that even if it managed to limp on, that it would bleed to death on the rock of Thermopylae. She stared at the monitor, and she began to plan. She had 36 hours.